All right, everybody, listen up and let's roll so that we can get done. I'm going to try and get done by 51, so we're out of here. First off, for this timeline, you can write number 7 up there. It is agricultural revolution, okay? Now, this is a weird timeline. Let's do 16, 17, 1800. Now, it's a weird timeline because there aren't really any events that are going to sit on this screen, that are going to sit on this board. We are instead going to draw one big line down the center, underneath that context box, down the center like this. We're basically going to fill out box 1, box 2, box 3, box 4, okay? Because the AgRev doesn't have a lot of singular dates, right? It's kind of hard to plot the AgRev on a timeline, but we know from the 1600s to the 1800s, things are going to change. The clusters for the AgRev, this might shock you, but we're going to put a triangle up here and put a line through it. This, along with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, are going to be the final death blows to the feudal system. The reason the feudal system works is because everybody spends 95% of their lives farming. Why do they spend 95% of their lives farming? Because technology is weak, because if they don't do it, they'll die. In fact, for box 1 over here, you can go ahead and write agrarian, because that's the kind of society we live in. You write down agrarian/feudal. In the context of this class, those things mean essentially the exact same thing, all right? So we are going to bring in more food, which allows people to take different jobs. It allows people to read. It allows to change most of that, all right? I think that's everything and makes sense. Okay, so over here, for agrarian society/feudal Europe, right? At 90%, 95% of society went out and they farmed every single day. What do we call that? That's subsistence. That's subsistence agriculture, okay? Where you farm just enough to feed your family and feed your community. We'll move on to a more productive farming with surpluses, but that's all we have. Now, what does that farming actually look like back then? It is a 3-crop rotation or a 3-field rotation. So this 3-field rotation, if you remember, they plant wheat in field A, they plant barley in field B, and what's in field C? Nothing. It is fallow, okay? It's empty. They just let clover and grass grow, and the cows walk along, eat it, fart, and poop on the field, which does replenish a little bit of nutrients, but not much. It's an incredibly inefficient system, and that's the primary thing we need to change. The other point we need to know about the agrarian society is the important stuff is not just the farming. It's also the fact that we live in this old feudal village. Okay? It's the tiny little village surrounded by farmland. Who owns the farmland? No. In this era, it's a communal. It's communal farmland. It's communal. It's owned by society. Everybody farms it together. The nobles don't care that everybody owns it because it's just peasants that go out there and shovel manure all day, and they need the peasants to go out there and shovel manure all day. The other thing to point is that the nobles/priests, they run everything, right? There's nobody else with power. Even the king doesn't have a lot of power. To end this, if you can give me a little box right here, wherever you want to put it, we're going to put 6 words, essentially, in a line. This is a summary of this timeline. This explains everything you need to know and everything I'm about to teach you. We started with an agrarian/subsistence farming. The next box, society is going to go through what? The agricultural revolution. Do you remember this list of 6 things? We go through the agricultural revolution. What are the inventions? We have the seed drill. We have fertilizer. What's in that 3rd field now? Beans, right? We are creating more crops, which means we need less farmers and we're running a surplus. Because we're creating a surplus, what kind of agriculture are we shifting into? Commercial agriculture. Once you can make money doing something, the nobles get involved. So the nobles get involved. They change the laws because they run everything from communal farms to the enclosure movement. Enclosure movement was when the nobles bought up all this now profitable farmland so that they can run the farms. Are bigger farms good or bad? They're good. We want big farms. We want machines. We want fertilizers. We want a massive farms that's worked by few people because we make a lot of food and people can do other stuff. But at the time for this transition, it's a bad thing because all of those farmers, they used to farm their entire lives, but at least they got paid in what? Food, okay? Getting paid in food is okay. You don't get to buy a lot of stuff, but you do know you get to feed yourself. Well, now they're getting paid in what? Money. They're no longer on the land. They're getting paid in money. That's the fancy word called proletarianization. So we're going to slowly lose jobs in the countryside. We're going to skip a blank space as we always do. What's the last word on this list? The most important outcome of the agricultural revolution is urbanization. That more than anything else will do a whole lot to change the society we live in. I've told you 1,000 times, I'll tell you again. When we have a whole bunch of people living out in the countryside, if their lives suck, then they suffer in silence and die alone. All right? But when we live in the city, if their lives suck, then they read newspapers, they talk with each other, they complain about politicians, and they eventually start throwing rocks and having a bread riot. The middle one is the weird zone. You only need to know for the AP test, and then you can move on with your life. It's where we had like industry out in the countryside. It's called the cottage industry / the putting out system. I'll describe that again. Don't draw this, but if you remember, we had like house A, house B, and house C. They can't be farmers anymore, so they're looking for work. And what they do is they realize they can buy a whole bunch of raw wool, spin it into thread, and then sell it to house B, who spins that thread into textiles, into cloth. And then they will sell it to house C, who cuts that cloth and sews it into t-shirts, and then they can sell it and make a profit, right? It's kind of industrial countryside industry. There's no steam engine invention yet. There's not enough people living in the cities. But this, we're essentially going to rewrite this now as we go. Next color, next box if you want. We go straight from 1 into 2. This is Agravan enclosure. The agriculture revolution and enclosure movement, we do the commercialization of agriculture. Commercialization of agriculture, that leads to enclosure. Large farms are good, but mostly for the rich. They're good for society as a whole, but the rich are the people benefiting from this. They are the ones now turning a profit. Okay? For the peasants, we said proletarianization. The biggest change is now they're working for, they earn wages. Now they earn wages, okay? And their life is worse. The problem with the good thing about earning wages is now you have money. It's a whole lot easier to buy goods, right? We're going to get to consumerism eventually. But, if you have to go around and trade corn for every pair of shoes you buy, you're just not going to buy that many shoes. It's incredibly inconvenient. But if you have a universal currency and you can just walk around that with your pocket, it's easier to buy and sell goods. If it's easier for you to buy things, it's easier for people to sell things. It's good for the economy. The problem is, what do you also have to buy? Food. And now the rich people own the food. The only reason they own the food is so that they can earn a profit. You remember they own the food. They own the food itself. They own the mills that grind the grain. They own the ovens that bake the bread. So it's really worse for this wage economy is really worse for peasants. Why is it worse for peasants? Well, they have less money. They have less money. That makes sense. Food prices rise. Overall, since they have less money, have less food, have less things, they have a lower, the biggest one on this line is lower quality of life. Life sucks a little bit more because of this, at least in the short term. The good thing might be that households / families, they work together. Right? They work together. Underline together so that you remember that this means men and women are working equally in their households. If you need to write down men plus women, please do so. But, in the cottage industry and the farms, men and women work together. This isn't revolutionary. This isn't crazy, but it's a key concept here because when we get into the industrial rev, no longer will men and women be able to work together. They will either work separately or we'll have that separate spheres where the man works, the woman's in charge of house and home. I do want to say that we lose the communal village life, okay? But we do retain a strong contact to the immediate family or the nuclear family. And the last couple lines down here, let's put urbanization. Now, we'll talk about urbanization in another timeline, but what we need to highlight here is that there's a problem when people move to cities here, okay? Inherently, that's not an issue, right? Cincinnati today has 500,000 people in it, and we do just fine, okay? But there was a problem with cities back then. What was the problem with cities back then? Yes? Close. There's an overarching problem that ties it all together. My answer is this. Cincinnati does a really good job with 500,000 people. New York does a really good job with 9 million people. Okay? If Cincinnati grew to 9 million people overnight, we would get better eventually, but we would suck in the short term because of overcrowding. Good. Overcrowding is the underline, and then we'll list the key concept problems. As Joe said, the best answer early on is sanitation. This is the Pooh River Day, okay? Because so many people live downtown, they have trouble getting waste and whatnot out of the city. Therefore, it gets in the wells. People get sick with what? Cholera, good. So we need to bring in fresh water. The other problem we have is, what did I highlight? Poverty. There aren't a lot of jobs in these early cities, and the jobs that do exist are bad. And if you have a whole bunch of really sick, poor people living in the city, then you also have a problem with crime. The issue that we'll mention here, okay, is what is the solution? The solution to all these things is what? The rich aren't going to take care of it. The poor can't take care of it. The only entity that can handle, guys, who's going to build sewage? The government. Who's going to bring fresh water in? The government. Who's going to start orphan programs, poverty programs, work reform, workers' compensation? Who's going to hire more police officers? The government here is the solution. The government getting bigger in these cities is a good thing because it makes the quality of life for most people better. Next color. We're going to go down here to 3. Goes like a clock. What we have here is the European market economy. Underline the word market or market economy. That's a big deal. Stick with me. We're going to go fast. All right. Once we start switching to a wave-driven society and we have money, we can still have a market economy. What's the buzzword for a market economy? Money's not bad. I'm going to go with consumerism, right? Or consumer stuff, whatever you want. Know that term. If you don't connect the terms, write down consumerism there. There's not a lot we're going to write down here, okay? If we're talking about economies in the 1700s, what era is the 1700s? No. Mercantilism is absolute monarch, 1600s into 1700s. What era goes from 1619 to 1789? What era goes from 1690 to 1789? That's the Enlightenment. If I ask you about Enlightenment economic thinkers, there's only one man from Scotland named Adam Smith. And what was his big idea? Laissez-faire, we'll just say free trade. Free trade grows. We also have market-driven prices, but more importantly, wages. The less workers there are, the more you have to pay workers. The more workers there are, the less we're going to pay workers. This is also where we mentioned the cottage industry and putting out system. And the weird thing that I don't really teach in class, but it is a key concept, is there are new financial practices. Now, if we're going to start investing in cities and we're going to start building really big companies, it's hard to do. Why? What'd you say? No, but good enough. What do you need before you can invent really big companies? What do you need before you get have people create really big companies? You need banking. So much so that the very first national bank in Europe is notable. Which country had the first national bank? Stop and think if you don't know. Banking helps build industry. Which country's first? England. The Bank of England is specifically a key concept. And then they have insurance on here too. On another timeline, we have things like joint stock companies are coming to be. That's where I can't borrow enough money to start a big business, but if I get 10 of you to invest with me, we can invest and create a business through stock market, blah, blah, blah. Last color. We're going to get down to the buzzer here, but I think I can finish. Okay. These are, there's the most is in this section, so write small. This is social changes. So we're essentially talking about some of the social changes that come along with the end of the agricultural revolution and the beginning of urbanization. The first weird one that we didn't talk about too much is we're starting to lose a little bit of that village life, but they retain a little bit of it. They still have these communal activities. Okay. These communal activities, they're a lot of them are called festivals or carnivals. And they're organized around one of two things. We still see it a little bit with the society, but when are our festivals? Think about an agrarian society, when are festivals going to be? Changing in the seasons is that you can be more specific than that. They're harvest festivals, okay? So they revolve around the agricultural calendar. Well, as agriculture becomes less significant, we start to organize these celebrations more so around what? Specifically, do you know which part of religion we organize them around? We still see them with a little bit with churches around, but they're saint feast days or just saints' days. They start gathering. If you go to Europe, cities like Florence and Paris and Cologne, they still have their major celebrations, aren't around harvest times or Christmas. They're around the saint of that city, his or her feast day. Okay? Now, the biggest thing is that, what do they say? There's no police out in these village times. The only real source of authority that runs things is the church. So the church, what do we call it? What's called church enforces norms. Right? As the church becomes the power in these small, or continues to be the power in these feudal villages, as they grow in size, the church becomes essentially the policeman, right? That handle the norms. So if you steal, the church is going to punish you. Not just through sins and purgatory, they're going to physically punish you. Adultery, pregnancy out of wedlock, right? The church becomes. They actually specifically mention public whippings. Specifically mention public. Okay, good. Next section. Here's the big one. So these two go together. You can draw that after. So before 1700. Before 1700, everybody died. Why? Good answer. We'll just say famine. And most of the time, famine happened because of weather. Human geo people, before 1700s, all the European countries were what? Gold star for grabs. Before 1700s, all the European countries were what? Bad weather, they all die. They were stage one of the demographic transition model, right? Everything fluctuates, okay? Now, in reality, the number one reason they die, though, we haven't listed yet. Most of the time, you don't have 2 weeks of rain in the summer, then you don't have a really big harvest, right? Not a lot of people straight up die of starvation, but since they don't eat well, what happens? They die from disease. You can even be more specific than you want, and they die of the bubonic plague, of the Black Death. The Black Death was not just a single event in the 1350s, right? It continues throughout Europe throughout all of this time, and that's because they eat really, really poorly, okay? But on a happy note, what's the positive of this? Sounds weird to say, right? But why do you all want a major global pandemic? Not like COVID. Let's actually kill 50% of the population. Why do you want that to happen, let's say 3 or 4 years from now? What are you going to be doing in about 4 or 5 years? Graduating from college, right? Why is it good if everybody dies? Job. Remember those market-driven wages, right? That's so. What's the actual term? It can mean higher jobs, higher wages, higher quality of life. With less competition, less overcrowding, the quality of life is actually bigger. After 1700, things change. If you had to pick everything that they changed, more food equals what? More people. If you had to pick any stat that changes, what's the number one reason population grows significantly when we get more food? Human geo people, what's the one stat to look at? If you don't know it, write it out completely. Not crude death rate, you can be more specific. The infant mortality rate, write it out if you don't know it, drops significantly, right? The most of the people that are dying are babies and kids 5 years old and younger. And the problem makes sense. If you have a mother that doesn't eat well for the 9 months of her pregnancy, she gives birth to a baby that might be more sickly. And then for the first year of that baby's life, he's wholly dependent on the mother for nourishment. If she continues to not eat well and be sickly, that baby is much more susceptible to disease and death. So more people are... Now, with a lower infant mortality rate, you can now trust that your kids are essentially going to grow to be adults, which means you spend more time on what? If you said education, you're right, but they use the term child rearing. So write it down. They say more focus on child rearing. Child rearing is raising a child, right? Making a loving, nourishing household so that the child can grow up and be successful. The number one way we can picture it is through education. Society starts spending more time investing in education. We're going to get the first major public education under Napoleon right here. It's not a coincidence. People suddenly care about kids because you can name them right away because you can trust that they're not going to die, at least not as much before. We also have... better nurses, we invest in orphanages, stuff like that. The last thing down here is more money equals a higher quality of life. What is proof of the higher quality of life? Let me just tell you, because you're already thinking it. Novels? Better houses? That makes sense. What else is on the key concept list? Oh, these two make sense. More taverns and theaters. What else? Cotton clothes. And what's the last one? Or mirrors. And what's the last one? If you get it right, we can be done. What'd you say, Lee? That's right. Porcelain dishes. All signs that the quality of life is better, according to the College Board. That's it. Thank you for your time. Finish writing that. You need to know it. Bell's going to ring in a second.